too. So take it
Sounds
away,
good.
Tanner.
All right. Well, like I said, thanks for having me back. I don't know if I didn't get to see who I was on last time. So if you uh, nobody knows who I am, or some of you don't, my name's Tanner. I live in, like I said, southern Missouri. I'm a unamended Christadelphian, part of the Ozark Mountain Ecclesia. But last week, we talked a lot. We covered a lot of stuff. Actually, I I have a tendency to be able to cram a lot in a little bit of time. But we talked about how Christ is going to conquer the earth, kind of how that would begin with obviously his return, the gathering of the saints, and going forth to save Israel from these. Basically, they're Islamic, not technically Arabic, but they're Islamic enemies round about them. And we looked at kind of briefly how that kind of it really perfectly sets up this Ezekiel 38 war. And I've just got to note that my internet connection is unstable. So let me know if if it starts cutting out, let me know and I'll swap to my phone hotspot. Um, but we saw the prophecies talked about how this first conflict ends, shows that Israel is saved, they are safe, they are rich, and they are disarmed, which is basically the criteria that we find in Ezekiel 38. Now, real quick, actually, before I forget, I want to show this. I find this very interesting. So this is the closest map that I can find that I think accurately represents Ezekiel 38 nations. I would preferably make my own map because there's a lot of different thoughts on exactly what Gomer represents and things like that. But we're talking about just generals here. I think this is kind of the Ezekiel 38 nations. And what's interesting, with the exception of Egypt, these are the Psalm 83 nations here. So if we're just looking at geography, there's no overlap between the Ezekiel 38 nations and the Psalm 83 nations, which seems to speak to the fact that they are completely separate conflicts. And as we'll see tonight, we'll see how these nations and the rest of the earth is actually conquered. But before I forget, this is what I was going to forget. I had somebody ask last time about Zechariah 14:2 and kind of my thoughts on that. I won't go into depth with that here. Basically, that's the verse that talks about Jerusalem being divided in half and kind of going and being spoiled and so on, things like that. I believe that was actually fulfilled with the 1948 war, and you kind of need to explain kind of the whole context and setup of chapters 12 through 14. So if anybody is curious about that, I won't go into that tonight, but I did type out a kind of explanation of it. So if you like that, just let me know and I can email it to you. But like I said last week, we saw how there were certain principles which Christ is going to be using to conquer the earth. And those are principles that were given to Moses and Joshua when they were conquering the land the first time. And it makes sense that these are the same principles Christ is going to be using because he's the greater Joshua. And the conquering in the first place was a shadow of this second and greater conquering. And basically, what those principles were is the nations that inhabited the Abrahamic lot, so the land that was promised to Abraham, they were to just be destroyed. They had to be destroyed because they can't be there if the kingdom of God's going to be there. But we saw this distinction of, for nations that are very far off, they are first to declare peace to the nation. And if they submit, then they become servants and tributaries. And then if they don't submit, then they're conquered and spoiled and so on. So we see that this is the same process Christ is going to be using. And now we're going to be looking at how he turns to these other nations and speaks peace to them. And it's really interesting when you look at these prophecies, because we see these same exact things. I think they're just, we tend to overlook them a lot. But Zechariah 9:10 is where we see one of these things. And this is right after Israel's been saved and disarmed. And it says, "And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off." So there's Israel disarmed. They don't need defenses anymore because Christ is there. And this is the next thing we read. "And he shall speak peace unto the heathen," which is the Gentiles, "and his dominion shall be from sea even to sea, and from the river even to the ends of the earth." So Christ's focus is initially inwardly on Israel because he needs to cleanse them and purify them. And I think there's a lot of things going on that we just don't have time to talk about tonight. But as we saw last time, the Lord's going to be wall of fire around these people because he's their defense from then on. They don't need any of these other defenses, and therefore the battle bow and everything is cut off. But what does it mean that he's going to speak peace to the nations? It's not like just giving them all this great news and it's going to be the best thing in the world for them. What exactly is he saying, though? And like we know from these Old Testament passages, it's not just a message of kindness. It's a basically call to submit or else, essentially. But as to what he's exactly going to say, I actually think we have this recorded for us, or at least the general meaning of it. If we look at Revelation 14, verses 6 and 7, so he's established the kingdom, and these are very crude borders. You can tell I drew this with my mouse, but it says here, and I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud, hour of his judgment has come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. So this proclamation is made to every nation on the planet and every people on the planet. And I think he's basically stating his identity and what he's going to do. He's going to rule the earth with a rod of iron in perfect righteousness. And the nations therefore have this opportunity to fear God and give glory to him and submit to him, basically. Unfortunately, we know that many nations don't actually do this. But before we actually get into what they're going to do, I think it's important to discuss the factor of time, because we talked about a number of different things that are going to be going on, like this road from Egypt to Assyria that's going to be built to bring back the remainder of the Jews that are in the earth. But it's not it's not all going to be done in a day. Now, whether that's going to be done before the next conflict, I don't really know for sure. But I think there has to be some amount of time between the Psalm 83 conflict and the Ezekiel 38 conflict, simply because it talks about Israel gathering spoil, and it's the spoil that Gog wants. So I don't know how much time. I'm going to say maybe a few weeks or months or something. There's no evidence for that. That's just kind of what I feel. But let's look at what actually is going to happen here. So the nations I think they're going to need some time to kind of absorb what's going on. And like we saw last time, one of the purposes of these campaigns is judgments. This is done so that the heathen may know, and we'll see that here in some of these passages as well. But as far as what the world knows at this point, obviously Christ has sent his dictate to the nations, but I don't think they're aware of many of the true facts. We've seen that the false prophet is it's one of the deceptive entities which is going to cause these nations to war against Christ. And I think part of this deception is almost certainly going to include a mislabeling of Christ himself as the Antichrist, or you're going to say that this is the devil himself coming. And while this spoil of these Psalm 83 nations is being gathered, other things are going on. This is when I think the nations are consulting. And but we know, Christ tells them do this or else. There's going to come a time when he's going to need their answer. And we have their answer recorded for us in Psalm 2. I think we're pretty familiar with this. And it says, "Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel."
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah. So, I mean, yeah, we see nations are angry. They're specifically counseling together and figuring out how they're going to war against Christ here, and trying to cast his cords away from them. And I think, like I said, this is the work of the frog spirit we're seeing here. And, I think there's going to be an amount of people being frantic initially, like, because we don't know what all they know. I think with this first conflict, they don't know a whole lot, but they do know that Israel is just really giving a whooping to these Arab nations, and they're taking their spoil. And we see what the world thinks of Israel right now. We can only imagine what they're going to think of in that future day. And if they were to do this kind of thing just this very day, we know the response would not be great. But I think a lot of people are going to look at this and think, well, the Jews are finally showing their true colors. They just want to wipe out all the Arabs, which is not true. But I think it's going to play to a lot of the beliefs that are out in the world right now. But we read on and we see Christ's response here. We see that he says, "He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them, not in peace, but in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion, I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that trust in him." One thing I want to notice in here, though, is it says, ask of me, and I'll give unto thee the uttermost parts of the earth. So it's not the nations round about, because I think he's already got those nations. The kingdom's already established. This is talking about all the other nations, or as it said earlier, those which are far off. And so we see this kind of indicated here in the passage. Now, another passage which we'll look at here, it's Jeremiah 23, or 25, 32, and 33. And this also shows kind of the response of the nations. And says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Behold, evil shall go forth from nation to nation, and a great whirlwind shall be raised up from the coast of the earth. And the slain of the Lord shall be at that day from one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth. It shall not be lamented, nor gathered, nor buried, it shall be dung on the ground." And what I see in this is kind of the same thing as in Psalm 2, but kind of the tying in of these frog-like spirits, because this great whirlwind is going up and it's kind of causing the nations to come up in war against Christ. And we know that the word spirit, looking at these frog-like spirits, the core meaning of spirit is a wind or a gust. It's breath. So I think we see that same kind of thing here. Now, at this particular stage, I don't think any of the nations have come against Christ yet. I wanted to show these just to show the consulting together aspect. But that actually brings us to this, what I call phase 2. And this subject has been debated a lot just because doesn't line up with the traditional view of the pioneer brethren with prophecy. But time has just shown that some of the projections aren't as tenable as they used to be. That's definitely a subject for another time, but big part of it was that the Arab nations were not foreseen to arise in the way that they are. The state of Israel, it wasn't believed that Israel would be an independent nation. It was supposed to be just a British protectorate basically for a while, and it was for a little bit, but things are definitely different now. Yet, as we see, right now there's nations in the kingdom proper that have to be removed. The question is just whether the scriptures tell us how that's going to happen or not. But as we saw, the scriptures kind of show that this first conflict sets the stage for the second. So, he's here. Okay, I guess we're still good. I can see you guys. But I find that much has been made of this conflict, and I don't find much support for that in the passage itself. The primary passage or passages for this conflict are Ezekiel 38 and 39, of course. I believe Revelation 20, some of the verses there refer to this as well, and particularly not Daniel 11, 40 through 45. I know that can be kind of a controversial subject and one that should be talked about later, but I find that to be perfectly fulfilled and have nothing to do with this at all. I just don't find them to be parallel prophecies. So like I said, I could talk about that later, but in looking at Ezekiel 38 and 39, there's a couple things we find unique with this. And similar to Psalm 83, we're actually given an exhaustive list of the nations involved here. So, like I said, this map I find to be generally accurate. But we're told that Gog, which we know is Russia, is going to be part of this, kind of leading this. Persia, we know, is Iran, and Iran was actually called Persia up until 1935, so that's a pretty easy one. Ethiopia It says that in the King James, but the word's actually Cush. And the Ethiopia today is a little further south than the land of Cush. So the Ethiopia in the King James is actually talking about Sudan. Libya is a pretty easy one. This map here kind of includes Algeria and Morocco for some reason. Now, Gomer, like I said, there's different thoughts on what the land of Gomer is. Some people say it's kind of just Bulgaria or Western Turkey here. Some include all the way up to Germany. So, for all intents and purposes, let's just say Germany and go with that for right now. Because I mean, the points, the whole world's going to be conquered with this, we know. But either way, we see that these nations are united in a confederacy. And I believe that this is actually the first group of nations kind of lumped in that Psalm 2 that's going to be coming against Christ here. And that's they've consulted together, they've got their own plan. They're going to be the first ones to act on it. And another thing we see with this conflict is, oh, sorry, can't forget Togarmah, which is Turkey. But what is motivating this war? The first war we saw was motivated by hate. This is, it's not a war of religion. It's very clear what this war is for, and it's specifically and only spoil. Ezekiel 38, it mentions this many times. It says here in 11 and 12, talking about Gog, and thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates, to take a spoil and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods, and that dwell in the midst of the land. Verse 13 talks about this too. But we see this very special situation here, which has to be true before Gog comes down. And I think specifically the situation in Israel is what kind of entices him to take this opportunity here. Assuming that satellites are still working at this time, they can see from their satellites that they don't have any defenses anymore. They got all these riches, but there's no defenses. Looks like they don't have any weapons or anything like that anymore. And yet what they desire is spoil. And it's not just any spoil. I think it's very interesting. It says, but the cattle and goods which they have gotten. Now, I want to emphasize this have gotten aspect because it indicates that it's not riches that Israel has always possessed, or even that has possessed for a long time. To me, it seems to indicate that it's the spoil which they recently obtained. They had just gotten this spoil from the Arab states. And in the prophecies concerning that first Muslim conflict, we saw that they gather gold, silver, apparel, even talks about cattle in abundance. So all the same things which Gog is specifically coming down for. Now, it is kind of interesting. It does seem that Gog makes his descent, or he begins his descent, and it's sometime after he's begun his descent that this evil thought comes into his mind. You'll ascend, come like a storm, like a cloud to cover the land, you and all your bands. It shall also come to pass that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and you'll think this evil thought. So I almost wonder, they're coming down, they've got weapons with them, so they're obviously intending to do harm. But was their intention merely to conquer at first, and then the spoils kind of a second thought that becomes the leading thought? Can't say for sure, but I think that's interesting. But one thing I think that has certainly been misrepresented or misunderstood is the extent of Gog's success, or lack of, I should say. And I think the main reason for this understanding is its correlation with Daniel 11, because we see very different things. There's nothing in Ezekiel 38 at all that says they overflow and just completely take over the land, or even cast the Jews out, or anything like that. They don't acquire really anything. Yet in Daniel 11, we read about this king of the north coming down, almost unstoppable. I mean, he overflows, passes over, takes everything, and he plants himself there for a bit. And there's a lot of issues with these correlations. Just one of them being that it's kind of understood that, if you read verse by verse in Daniel 11, which is very chronological, talks about king of the north overflowing and so on. And what it's believed is that he overflows, he plants himself in Israel, then Michael stands up and brings the king of the north to his end. But when we actually look at what it says, the king of the north comes to his end, and it's after that that Michael stands up. So it just doesn't really fit very well, and the differences are far too numerous to discuss here. But what we do know for sure about Gog and his confederates from these chapters specifically about them is that they come like a cloud to cover the land. Now, this doesn't mean that they are covering the land of Israel. They're coming like a cloud to cover the land. So, I mean, I think it's just talking about the size of their armies as they're moving on their way down to Israel. So, the extent of the progress we read here, it says, "And it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath I have spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel, so that the fishes of the sea, the fowls of heaven, and the beasts of the field, and all creeping things that creep upon the earth, and all men upon the face of the earth shall shake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. And I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord. Every man's sword shall be against his brother, and I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood, and I will rain upon him, and upon his band, and upon the many people that are with him, in overflowing rain, and great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. Thus will I magnify myself, and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord." Now, a couple things on this is how they're destroyed is interesting. You know, they're destroyed by, it seems like the Lord confuses them where they're turning against each other, but most of these things are from heaven. There's rain, hailstones, fire, and brimstone from heaven. And note that this happens when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, not after he has overrun it, not after he's planted himself in it. It's when they come against him. You know, we don't even read anything about Israel's response to this at all. There's no even sense of them being afraid or anything. So it really indicates, if we're going by what it strictly says, they're destroyed before any real damage can be done. And there's a couple questions I had on this, which I was able to answer, and I'll try to mention them here in a bit. But we see the same exact thing in this parallel passage of Revelation 20. And this says here, and it talks about this, the dragon going forth to deceive the nations, which is similar to what we saw earlier. And it specifically says, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about in the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. So once they compass the camp of the saints about, that's when they're destroyed. It's not after they've penetrated or taken over it. So it's simply the surrounding of the kingdom. It's not the invasion of it. And it fits perfectly with what we see in Ezekiel 38. And as far as imagery goes, it really matches up to what we see in, we won't read it for now, but I think many of us are familiar with the Isaiah 36 and 37 account where, the Assyrians surrounded Israel. They took all the fortified cities, they're surrounding them, and that's when the angels smote them and they woke up and everybody saw that they were dead. The same thing we kind of see in 2 Chronicles 20 when Edom, Ammon, and Moab, they came against Israel, but they're defeated on their way to Israel. And the only thing that Israel had to do was go out and gather the spoil. So it's the same kind of imagery and verbiage that we see in those passages. But another important thing that we see is they compass the camp of the saints. And we know just from what Brother Thomas believed and understood that he believed that Gog would come down, basically overflow the land, and it would be then that Christ and the saints appear. So he did not believe that there would be saints, immortalized saints in the city when Gog comes down. And I think that's one reason why he thought this had to be the end of Christ's reign here and not, towards the beginning of it. But as we've seen from these other prophecies with these Arab hordes and things like that, Christ is in the land. So it makes perfect sense to me and fits perfectly. But we see, as far as the judgment goes, see, I'm behind on my slides again. These are some of the passages that show, Christ is in the land as a result of defeating these Arab nations. So if you weren't here last time, you can either watch it or just jot these down here. But as far as the judgment on Gog, we also see some very important and different things. With the first conflict, we see that not only is it Christ and the saints that come, Zechariah 14:5 says that. There's a bunch of verses that talk about the saints in Christ being the cause of their victory. And it even says in Zechariah 14:14 that Judah also shall fight at Jerusalem. But with the Gogian conflict, we see something very different. It says that, like we mentioned, brothers turn against brother, all of these things pour down from heaven. That's the only thing that destroys him. So we don't have any mention of Christ, the saints, or Israel doing anything to destroy Gog or any of his confederates. So, as another way of kind of piecing these things together, I realized a lot of these little ties as I was kind of putting these things together. But the primary way that Gog is destroyed is by literal fire and brimstone. It mentions that as part of the judgments in Ezekiel 38, but it's the only thing mentioned in your Revelation 20. It's just fire coming from heaven. Now, with the Psalm 83 conflict, we see this fire is used to describe Israel's enemies being destroyed. I got a bug flying in front of me. But it's never used in the literal sense. It's always in a figurative sense. For example, all these passages here use it, but in Obadiah it says Israel would be like a fire and Esau would be like chaff, but it's not actually fire. But with the Gogian from Confederacy, it's just fire. And I was wondering, well, why is it specifically fire? But as we said earlier in Zechariah 2:5, when it talks about the Lord reigning in Jerusalem, they're so filled with spoils and goods that they don't have any walls, bars, or gates. And this is what it says: He, the Lord, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. So, basically, the reason they're destroyed by fire is because now the Lord is their defense by fire. And that's a wall is supposed to be for defense. So when they come against the kingdom, that's what destroys them. I just found that really, really interesting. But now I want to see this from the Lord's perspective and why this conflict even occurs in the first place. We not only see, I think sorry, I'm kind of ahead of myself here. I think there's kind of two general purposes to this. And taken specifically from the text itself, the first thing we see is to, again, teach the nations through example. Verses 16 and 23 of Ezekiel 38 say that I'll bring thee against my land. Why? That the heathen may know me, when I shall be sanctified in thee, O Gog, before their eyes. So we know they're going to see this because we're told this is going to be done before the world's eyes. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself. I'll be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I'm the Lord. I think I used to, personally at least, used to really overlook these verses and just kind of write off the whole that they may know me thing. But it means something. And I think this is the only thing it can mean. It's to make an example of Gog and tell the rest of the nations, while the rest of you guys are consulting and figuring out what you want to do, look at what just happened with these people who tried to come against me. I'm trying to give you an informed decision here. The same thing is kind of emphasized in chapter 39. I'll set my glory among the heathen, and all the heathen shall see my judgment that I have executed, and my hand that I have laid upon them. So I think sometimes wonder how much of this is the world actually seeing, but it's clear that they're seeing a lot here. So I don't really think that the world's going to lose all their communication systems, because that's the only way the whole world is going to know about some of these things. Now, the second reason relates to Israel. And we see with Gog, everything is about teaching. It's either teaching the nations or teaching Israel. And specifically in the 39th chapter, it says, So will I make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them pollute my holy name anymore. And the heathen shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. It's another one of those. So the house of Israel shall know that I am the Lord their God from that day and forward. Now, we've seen that Christ is in their midst, and I want to suggest to you that this is not Jesus executing this judgment here, but specifically God himself. They saw the power and might of Christ coming against their enemies. And while I think they've truly been told, yes, I'm your Messiah, but there's not another God, but the true our Father, the God in heaven. They haven't had any tangible proof of this aspect. So while it is, Christ is the one worthy of the throne, it's actually God's throne that he's going to be sitting on. And that's why at the end of his reign, after he subdued all enemies, God himself comes down and sits on the throne. So the purpose of this conflict is to teach Israel, and I think they know for certain that not only is there a Messiah in their midst, but there is also a God in heaven who is protecting and watching out for them. Um, so that's why I think we don't read of any other judgment being executed by anyone else. It's only from heaven itself where God is. Um, Now, as to the aftermath of this conflict, we'll just kind of mention this briefly for time's sake, but um, we not only see the destruction of the Confederacy itself, but that fire is sent on Magog and on those in the Isle. So basically, the home territories of these nations, fire and judgment are sent on them as well. And I think potentially part of the reason for this is to destroy the rulers, because assuming this happens relatively in the future, and Putin's the Gog himself basically, I don't think Putin's going to be with his troops when they're destroyed surrounding Israel. This is why I think the fire is sent to do away with those wicked rulers. Um, but I think it's just further judgment on these nations. Now, I think the number of slain, and I mean how the size of these hordes is going to be really too difficult for us to grasp right now. Talks about the fowls of the air coming and having this great feast because there's so many slain. It takes Israel 7 months to bury the dead and burn the weapons, and even still, there's more they got to do. Um, and that's kind of interesting. Is this is the only role that we read about Israel in here? Is they go out and they burn the weapons and they gather the spoil. Now, we don't have time to look at this in depth, but this is a question I had when I was looking at this. And it seemed initially to me as a problem until I looked into it. In the 39th chapter, it says, talking about the Israel, they shall burn their weapons with fire, and they shall spoil those that spoiled them, and rob those that robbed them, saith the Lord God. Now, my question was this: if as the passages say, Gog is destroyed when he comes against Israel, how can it be said that they spoiled or robbed the Jews? And I think with this, we see a similarity between this conflict and the Muslim conflict, because we saw without question Judah is allowed to fight at Jerusalem against the Islamic court. And I think part of the reason is because over 100 years, they've been these thorns in Israel's side. I think the Lord's just allowing them to have this aspect of um, executing vengeance on their enemies. And I think we see kind of a similar thing with Russia here, and not just Russia, but their Confederates. And especially when you know about the history of the Jews' time in Russia and some of these other nations right before they were made a nation, it makes a lot of sense. It's the atrocities are too difficult to really even talk about. But there's a book I've been reading through. If you can see this, it's called A History of the Jews. Excellent. It's a secular book, but he talks about specifically before Israel became a nation, almost the majority of Jews actually were in Russia. And some of the worst times ever experienced by the Jews were under these Russian czars. I started underlining all the terrible things they did and how many people they killed and stuff they stole and robbed, and it's too hard to count. But basically, it sums it up by saying, for nearly a century and a half, the Jews of Russia had lived in darkness under the most brutal despotism in modern history. So, I think we're all familiar with the Holocaust and things that happened with that, but I think we're a lot less familiar with the actual facts of Israel's time in dispersion and all these other factors that caused them to become a nation again. So, when we look at the history, we see we see the fittingness of this, that basically all it's saying, I think, is, this is not the first time Gog and his Confederates have harmed and robbed and stole from the Jews or anything like that. They're finally exacting their vengeance. And that's why it doesn't talk about Russia spoiling them or robbing them, but it shows, or at least not in this context and chapter here, but it shows Israel regathering these things from them. Now we've seen how the Gogian Confederacy is handled, and I think as a result of this, and forgive my horribly crude map here, the kingdom is now expanded to these territories. And that's just the rule of conquest. You win, you take in all the lands, and this is not the kingdom of God. This is the empire of God, basically. Kind of like Rome or Britain. The specific land of Rome itself was very small. Britain's not very big, but their empires were enormous. I think that's the same kind of thing we see with the kingdom here. And as these lands are brought in under the scepter of Christ, I think that's when the blessings come on them. If they don't come up to worship and keep the Feast of Tabernacles, there's the no rain and all these other things. But and honestly, I think this map probably doesn't show the correct number of nations, simply because, as we've seen, there's a teaching aspect here. And because of that, we kind of assume that there's probably going to be a few nations, maybe particularly those who are kind of close to. We just aren't specifically told who those are. But as you can see, there's a lot of the rest of the world to be conquered. And I think that's how we get to, this brings us to phase 3, or what I call a final phase. Now, what we've seen so far, I'm going to try to go through this at a decent pace here. We can try to keep up with it still. The first 2 conflicts we see, it's nations that are specifically mentioned. We're told these are where these nations are. Now, with this third phase, we see something different. This is a war against a system and an ideology. And that's very different, because those are not restricted to a certain geography like nations are. Wherever people are, systems and ideologies exist. And that's what we see with this Babylonian harlot system. Now, there's different facets to the latter-day aspect of this system. And basically, they're described as the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Now, some of these obviously have territories. The false prophet, or the Pope, he's got Vatican City and a lot of rule in Europe. But their influence and the what's the word? The system which they promulgate, that covers the earth. But most of the passages which show their destruction are in Revelation. A lot of them are in the Old Testament as well. Kind of just focus on the Revelation ones now. But that being said, we can actually trace this system back to Genesis 10. Now, the Babylonian system, this began with Nimrod. He's actually credited as the man who founded Babel. And Babel is Babylon. Some people disagree with that, and I don't understand why. But there's just all kinds of evidence for it. The World History Encyclopedia says that Babylon, the name is derived from Bavel or Babelim, which in Akkadian meant the gate of God. The Bible Atlas says that the Hebrews, this is talking about Babylon, the Hebrews called the country as well as the city Babel. So Babel is Babylon. Now, Babylon it's influenced every nation on the earth, and because we read about all the nations of the world having drunk of the wine of her fornication, and you kind of wonder how. And I think this is how we see it. The whole doctrine of the Trinity, this began with Nimrod when he himself was deified. His wife basically made herself a god, and then she had her son, which was Nimrod reincarnated, basically. But not to draw too much on that, but with the Tower of Babel, we see this big act of rebellion by man against God. Some people believe that the tower was built because they feared another flood, and they wanted to be up high enough to not be killed by it. But once the nations were confounded by these different languages, all the men separated to the different parts of the earth by their languages. So when they went to the different corners of the earth, they brought their Babylonian systemish ways with them. So, and actually, all these names here, these are all names of different religions and their main god. They're just names for this Nimrod. So different cultures, they have the same gods, basically. They just put their own names on them to make them unique, or what they think is unique. So then I think it's in this way that we can see that every nation has been affected by the Babylonian system, because it's actually rooted in the very systems themselves. And that's why when we read in Revelation 18, all nations have drunk the wine of the wrath for fornication. That's true. So, as every nation is drunk of this form of fornication, the destruction of this system really does encompass the rest of the planet. There's a lot of parts of this, and we'll just kind of hit some of the high points here. But as we said, there's three active parts of this system: the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. And I think much of this is just basically represented with the modern papal systems in Europe. But like I said, the reason for these conflicts is different. The first conflict's animated by hate. The second conflict's by spoil. But this third conflict is a battle of over religion and ideology and control. It's spiritual Zion versus spiritual Babylon, and it's a matter of doctrine and principle. The nations are going to want to walk in their own ways. Since the frog spirits have begun, they've really been able to or make great success in getting God and the Bible out of their systems. And they're really just now starting to do that. And they're not going to want to give it up very easily. So even if it means blessedness and a righteous rule under Christ, they're not going to want to submit that. And as we look at the world today, like I said, we see that how they're being prepped for this. So this is when I believe the warring aspects of Psalm 2 and Jeremiah 25 take place, where the slain of the Lord at that day shall be from the one end of the earth even to the other. This is something else I realized as I was putting this together. We saw in Deuteronomy 20:15 that they're going to conquer these nations which are very far off, also defined as from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth. That's back in Deuteronomy. But in Jeremiah, it uses the same exact term. The slain of the Lord shall be at that day from one end of the earth, even to the other end of the earth. So this is the prophecy. I mean, this is a prophecy as well, but this is showing Christ actually fulfilling his conquest here. I think that's another tie that's often overlooked. But how is this going to begin, and how will it be carried out? Well, I think with Israel's kind of a good example of this. If you want to destroy a system like this, you got to destroy the cause of it, and then you can start working at getting rid of its influence. Like I said, we don't have time to go into the particulars of the destruction of the false prophet, the beast, and the dragon, but we'll basically just kind of, for time's sake, say this is the western half of Europe that we're talking about here. So Revelation 19 talks about this, and it sums it up pretty well, actually. And I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. And his eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. And he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. So this is Christ, obviously with a warlike attitude, sitting on a horse. And it says, and the armies which were in heaven followed upon him on the white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of God Almighty. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So this is Christ in the saints. This obviously, it's not just Christ here. It's these the armies of these political heavens on white horses going with him as well. And it continues, showing the destruction of some of these systems. So an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, come and gather yourselves together unto the supper of the great God, that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, of mighty men, of horses, and them that sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bond, small and great. Now, I think, with all of these conflicts, there's going to be so many slain. I don't find that one thing to be, Ezekiel 38, it talks about fowls of the earth coming up and devouring them. That's something that's going to be true of every conflict whenever there's a lot of people destroyed. So I don't see that as unique to one of these conflicts. I think it's true of all of them. But it says, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone, which is basically Revelation speech for everlasting destruction. And the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which proceeded out of his mouth. The fowls were filled with his flesh. Now, this is specifically talking about the false prophet and the beast being destroyed here. It's possible that the dragon is destroyed in slightly different way. It seems like it's potentially after Gog is destroyed, based on Revelation 20, that the dragon is destroyed, which we understand to be basically paganism. But like I said, like a lot of things, I hate to say this so much, but that's a subject for another time. But what's interesting is we read that there's the 10 horns of this beast, kind of the military horns of this beast. They're fighting against Christ, but then we find that they later turn against the harlot. So we won't read this, but it says that these horns, which were fighting against Christ, and they turn to this harlot, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. So, and I believe they do this because they finally realized that the papal influence was actually deceiving them. They realized that they were actually being deceived. And I think part of this is lumped up in Jeremiah 16:19, when it says that if the Gentiles shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth, and shall say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. And I think that's the realization that we were being deceived by the system. And the end of this, obviously, is that Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations to drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And she turned so many people away from the truth of God, as they did from the beginning with Nimrod. Yet, as we learn from Revelation 18, it says, many nations shall bewail her and lament her when they shall see the smoke of her burning. So that's there, right there, says that Babylon's destroyed, but the people in the rest of the earth that were influenced by her, they still remain to be conquered as well. Now, once the I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but I think it's after this that Christ and the saints go to these other nations, and I don't think they're going to be as big of conflicts as any of these that we've seen, because their leader's already been destroyed. There might be some conflicts and things, and but we know that this is how it's going to weeding out this influence from every corner of the earth. But we know from Isaiah 9:7, it says, of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end. So it's just going to continue to expand and increase. And the more it increases, the more peace and righteousness ensue. So it spreads over the whole earth. And now, finally, this is when this saying is finally fulfilled. And the seventh angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Now this is completed. The earth is, in the terms of Numbers, I think it's Numbers, it says, all the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the Lord. And it's not the glory yet, because there's still mortals and God himself has to come down, but it's filled with the knowledge of the Lord. Another way we see this, and this is remarkable, it's Revelation 15. Because we read about, when we talk a lot about now, the nations being likened to the sea and the waves roaring. There's just war and all this conflict going on. But in this time, we see something very different. And I saw, as it were, a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. So it's not sea and waves roaring anymore. The sea is so still, it's likened to glass. I don't usually get to see this often myself. If you've ever seen water that is perfectly still, I mean, even this, you can see there's ripples out there. It's not like glass. This is total pacification. It's total peace. There's nothing disturbing the waters, and it's mingled with fire, which means it's mingled with judgment. And it's judgment that brought this peace. It's judgment and the righteous law of Christ that's going to keep this judgment and keep the nations peaceful. And we see that these who gained, they destroyed the beast and so on, they're standing on the sea of glass, showing that they conquered it. The saints have a part in this here. And now we read that they sing the song of Moses. This is just the next couple of verses. They sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy. For all nations shall come and worship before thee. For thy judgments are made manifest, meaning that they've been executed. Everybody knows the judgments now. Now all nations are coming to worship because all nations are conquered at this point. Um, so we'll fully end the Davidic phase of Christ's reign of conquering and begin the Solomon phase where it's nothing but peace and righteousness within all of his borders here. Um, War, no more. Swords and things beaten to plowshares, never to be changed again. But we know that we won't talk about the kingdom age itself really, but it consummates in the end of Christ's reign of the 1,000 years where sin and death themselves are destroyed. Once the last mortals are made immortal, I mean, that's when the saying comes to pass that, do I have it here? Yeah. So once there's no mortals left, um, well, I'm kind of ahead of myself again, but basically, the saying is brought to pass that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. And that's 1 Corinthians 15:54. And this is what we read about the end. Christ has to rule till every single enemy is subdued. So even sin and death themselves, they have to be subdued before his reign ends. And then cometh the end, when he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father, when he shall have put down all rule and all authority in power. For he must reign till he hath put all enemies under his feet, and the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. And when all things shall be subdued unto him, then shall the Son also himself be subject unto him that put all things under him, that God may be all in all. Basically, God helped Christ put all things under him. Once God himself comes down, Christ fully gives everything up to him, and he's always been subservient to him, but it is fully God's kingdom and only God's kingdom at that time. And now that there are no mortals left, God himself come down. And this talks about in Revelation 21 of this new heaven and the new earth. The old ones are passed away, and there was no more sea. There's no more carnal nations anymore because there's no more mortals. There's no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven. And in verse 3 it says, and I heard a great voice saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. God shall wipe away tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, sorrow, or crying, or pain, for the former things are passed away. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new and right, for these words are true and faithful. Now that's the end of the matter. What happens after this? Maybe a new creation or things we don't know, but a wonderful end it is. And I want to just close by focusing on this last phrase. John is given this vision, and he sees God sitting on the throne, and God's telling John, write the things that you're seeing right now. Well, why write them? It's right because these words are true and faithful. This is talking about after Christ's reign is over. I mean, Christ's return, sometimes it seems like it's a ways in the future. This is even further in the future. Yet it is so certain that it's set in stone. And God says, write these things. Every one of them, everything you see is true and faithful. And what a blessing it is to even have an opportunity to know about these things and be offered a part in this plan. I mean, what wondrous things really await those who take on the name of Christ and keep their garments pure and white till the end. And the last thing we'll mention here is one of the many, many things we're promised. It says, to those who overcome, will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne. I mean, that's an honor that I know I can't really fathom. Christ was given the right hand of God to sit on. Christ is offering us the opportunity to sit on his right hand. And if that's not something that we should motivate us and strengthen us to do everything we can to set aside any stumbling blocks before us, I'm not sure what really would. But I hope this was profitable. I feel like I was running through a lot of this. I will actually publish the written document so people can go through things on their own time and actually absorb it if they want. And obviously, fact check stuff. I really encourage all that all the time. Um, but yeah, hopefully you guys got something out of it.